I'm very pleased to be able to join this discussion and provide some thoughts on UNDP's perspective on recovery. And it has been long decades of work that UNDP is speaking from in this area. And the first thing that I would like to state here is that UNDP's definition of recovery is something that equals like a transformative process. It's a transformative process through which households and communities rebuild their assets, restore their livelihoods, and strengthen the capacities to manage the impacts of a future crisis. So it actually seeks to deliver a set of interventions which improves the well-being of men, women, boys and girls, people with disabilities who are affected by crisis. Therefore, for us, when we speak about recovery, the focus of our support is always people and how we can build resilience of people and communities in the aftermath of crisis. In that sense, I think UNDP, when we say recovery, it emphasizes that it's very critical that recovery and reconstruction are not synonymous terms. We look at reconstruction and rehabilitation as processes that are subsumed within recovery, simply because we understand that while people are affected by disasters, there are tangible and intangible effects on the people. That means that people can lose their assets, they lose their houses, but as a result of that, it triggers a number of other effects, which is about displacement, which can increase in gender-based violence, result in child labor, teen pregnancies, abuse of elderly, and so on and so forth. So therefore, when we talk about reconstruction, however, we can put a very nice time frame to it. In 4 years, 7 years, you can reconstruct roads, build bridges, and houses. But sometimes the other intangible effects on the lives of people can take much more better and much longer. And therefore, I think it's important that we don't equate the two terms of recovery and reconstruction as one. Rather, reconstruction is one process which is about rebuilding of structures, but recovery is about people's lives, and therefore it's difficult for us to say when a full recovery can take place, and this challenge is often not recognized. However, I've just noticed that, and I'm very pleased to note that the government of India has recently started working on the recovery guidelines for India. And it is very progressive in that sense that it not only has these guidelines developed, but even prior to that, through the Finance Commission, has very standard and separate set of resources allocated for recovery, which was not the case a couple of years earlier, where governments had to make a choice between spending all their money on response items, and it was considered to a certain extent recovery. But right now, they can look into reconstruction, supporting of livelihoods of people. And I think this is a big dichotomy. This is a big gap when recovery policies are made with good intentions. But even with organizations like UNDP, we always have to have this balance between how much do we spend directly on reconstruction and how much of it on people and building of assets and supporting livelihoods of people. So this is one important point. We also noticed that several countries get into the space of recovery without any planning from before. So if there is a planned method, because we understand recovery transcends several planning cycles in a government, and therefore it's quite important that we prepare for recovery. And therefore UNDP always advocates for what we call recovery preparedness or pre-disaster recovery planning, which gives governments the time to build up institutions, define a policy of a recovery, to define within that what is the provisions you have for people's livelihoods and asset, how would you support the most vulnerable, but also at the same time look at what will be the roles of non-governmental organizations, different groups, the private sector, charitable organizations in the process of recovery. Because while the government leads recovery processes, it is everyone who contributes to it and thus makes a stronger recovery process. So I think that clear delineation of roles and responsibilities of state and non-state actors in a recovery policy or a guideline prior to disaster helps much better in planning for recovery. And the third thing that I would say that, you could also plan for how to rebuild better, build back better, or building better forward is a cliche it has become a cliche, and we've heard that very often. But planning for building back better requires investment in terms of training local artisans in disaster resilient construction technologies. It gives for better social protection mechanisms, which should be flexible and be allowed to expand and scale up, and sometimes even front load the benefits when we know a disaster is coming. And it allows also women's organizations and organizations working with people with disabilities to come forward with their own measures of what they would do in terms of covering recovery. Therefore, I think number one is that recovery is a long-term process, and therefore we need to prepare for it. Number two is recovery is led by the government, but is contributed together by all different sectors of non-state and state actors, and they should be brought on board. Number three is that we prepare for building back better by training, capacity building, delineating roles and responsibilities, establishing social protection mechanism, establishing rules and regulations for recovery. And I think this is the way that is the going forward. Prepare for recovery even before a disaster happens, just as we prepare for response. And with that, I think I would like to end this and congratulate once again IIHS for this very valid discussion, important discussion on recovery with dignity. And that is, I think, the key point. How do people recover with dignity and not as a charity? Thank you very much.